Hello and welcome to Short Tales. For today's episode, I am very, very pleased to be joined by the always delightful Jackson Baly. Welcome, Jack.
Too kind. Thank you. Thank you for having me on. Always delightful's good.
Well, you are. You're a constant delight.
That's too lovely.
Thanks for coming on. I've been so looking forward to this chat. I love chatting with you anyway, but the topic you've chosen is one that's like so perfect. One, because I love it. I love reading what we're going to be talking about. I love writing what we're talking about. I definitely love talking about what we're going to be talking about. And I'm talking around it, so why don't we just jump straight in? Jack, what are we talking about today?
Today we're going to be talking about writing for genre or writing genre specifically, I guess.
Yeah, exactly right. Which, to me, I think it's perfect for this podcast because basically all the stories I share are mostly genre. I think all of them are genre in one way or another. For me, I find that's just that's what I'm interested in. Not that I would never read sort of more classical. I don't even know what the term for non-genre is.
I guess kind of in a way everything is some kind of genre, but then there's like a specific vibe when you say you're writing for genre. You know what I mean? Yeah. Somehow that is more interesting. Yeah.
Well, I think to me, the way I sort of define it is it's that standard human existence. We're just talking about actual real world. Yeah. Nothing is sort of that eclectic or eccentric or exaggerated. It's just our world and people living in it, and we're going to tell their stories. That's sort of
that's kind of your baseline, I guess, non-genred story.
Where the genre stories it takes that, but it just adds something.
Some layer, whatever that layer happens to be.
And for me, I think it's I live that other existence every day. It's fine. It's good. It's
nothing wrong with it.
Yeah. But throw in something a bit weird or interesting or scary, then I'm interested.
You need that little hook. Otherwise you're you're right. I don't think I would ever, if somebody was here's a realistic character piece about a person. Yeah. It's not like I would turn my nose up at that. But sometimes you need a little something. You know?
That's it. And I even think about the genres I really enjoy the most. So I'd say fantasy, sci-fi, horror, mystery would be my top four. And I think because it's all of them add something, a little extra spice to the meal. Where the genres I find I don't seem to get off on as much Western, maybe romance. Yeah. Because again, I still think, they're still too close to real world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. You can still have, and when you hear about a Western or a romance that has that little bit extra, all of a sudden you're interested.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That's because I guess it's kind of the same thing. It gets a Western is just that happened. That's historic.
Right.
You know what I mean?
It's history. It's
we were there, and not that I'm against that. I I can read historical nonfiction. Yeah, I love that. I'm all over that. But then historical fiction, I'm I might as well be reading about something that, and I guess maybe in that situation, it's the little extra spice is that it's real. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think actual history is so mind-blowing because you're no one's trying to manipulate me and come up with the most interesting thing. No, they're just writing down what freaking happened, which is crazy. But then as soon as you have historical fiction, you're all right, we'll throw a fucking alien in there or something, guys. Come on.
I know, you can do anything you like. Why is it so boring and normal? Do you ever find when you're writing, you will... how, I guess, close to the genre will you try and stick? Or is, in your head, are you I am writing a genre piece? Yeah. Or is it just kind of whatever you're writing, whatever comes out is sort of what
that's
you
a great question because, I think when we talk about genre, obviously, usually I'm finding I want to write in that genre because I'm wanting to hit those tropes. Yeah. I think with genre, it's so important to know the tropes of the genre, for both for yourself, but also for an eventual audience. Yeah, yeah. Because I think if you don't hit them, you're sort of making a promise you're not going to fulfill on.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think there's genre stories I find myself getting most frustrated with where it's you sort of dabbled in it, but you actually don't care about the genre. You're not caring the tropes. So for me, it's I come to it with I want to play with those tropes. I want to play in that sandbox and sort of see what I can come up with. Is that how it works for you?
Well, yeah, I sort of kind of. I've recently started trying to write little short horror stories and I wrote a couple of them and at the end of them I was this isn't really scary or necessarily horrifying. It's just weird. And I was is that because I did set out to be this is kind of maybe a spooky notion or whatever. Yeah. The first one I had, it was just a random thought where I was what if there was a group of people trying to deepen a well in the front of a church and they dig down and the shovel instead of goes through the dirt and a bunch of blood spurts out. And I was okay, what's going on? And then I'm maybe as they dig deeper, they move through skin and then membrane and then skull and then full on brain and then they fall into the brain.
That's awesome.
And I'm but that's not really scary. It's just a kind of fucked up thing that happened.
Yeah.
So, but I definitely set out to be this is a horror story. Yeah. But then in the end, I was like, well, I actually don't know what it is. But then you have the genre weird fiction,
yes,
which is a nice catch-all term.
Yeah, it really covers it all.
Weird fiction, whatever, you know what I mean? It's just like regular. It's the same thing. It's regular existence, and then something's a little strange, something's a little off, a little different.
Yeah,
and you can just call it weird fiction. You kind of get away with it.
Yeah, exactly. I find the same for like speculative fiction is one that comes up a lot in terms of like people like, oh, we don't need to call it sci-fi or fantasy. If you want to merge them together, you call it speculative fiction. You're like, but any fiction is speculating.
Yeah, I know. You're always speculating.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That sounds super interesting, though. So, like, when you're writing that one, like, I guess you're sort of saying it, you started as horror, but it sort of bent away from it.
Well, yeah, I guess it was like, because it just started, like, the idea was, what if there was a huge guy under a church?
Yeah, that
was the very first thought. That was like, what if there's a big guy under a church? And then, yeah, I guess the direction I went in is I'm like, well, what could be scary about this? Because that's not really a story. There's a big guy under a church.
Yeah.
And then it was like, well, let's, what can I do here? How can I make this scary? And then like, how the story ends is the guy digging down deeper into the well, into the giant guy digs through the skull, they chop it away with a chainsaw, and then slips in, falls into the brain, because the brain in reality I think is not super solid, so it just kind of like sucked down into that, disappears.
Yeah,
I was like, well, that's kind of scary, but it's still not like I don't think I did a good job of building tension. It just sort of happens. So I don't know.
Yeah. And like this is where, like, again, if we're talking genre, this is where it's so interesting, because like any genre is always a spectrum. Yeah, and not even like a single line linear spectrum. It's like a 3D orb spectrum. Is how define absolutely. It. Where like in some ways, if you go over here and you could go, oh, okay, well that's body horror, and the other end of that is obviously, well, not really body horror, maybe. Yeah. But then, there's so many different facets you can take in to say this is horror or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
So obviously me and Sean and Tom do Scaredy Boys, and like having now watched a crazy amount of horror, you realize just how versatile a single genre really is when you dive deep on any one genre. So like I think it would still fit 100% into horror. Yeah, but it also would fit into weird. Like
and I think that's the kind of I don't know. For me, it's kind of like I'll pick horror as the genre, and then wherever the dart lands is the specific kind of horror. The specific genre. Yeah, like within horror that it'll end up being. Yeah,
and that's it. Like I really like talking about genre, thinking about genre, and exploring different genre pieces, but I also think when you're writing, you almost like don't want to think about it. Like, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Like, and that's true for so much writing, like advice, writing lessons that people give you, any of that sort of stuff, where it's like, here are the rules to writing. You're like, yes, but forget about it until after that first draft.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you're trying to, I feel like if you're trying to sort of like tick those boxes and hit those points instead of just writing a story, I don't know, but it feels like it's not going to be as interesting a story. Like if you think fantasy is your genre, right? You're like, well, I'm just going to write a fantasy story.
Yes.
Like fantasy, I think even more than horror as a genre, it is so broad and so wide.
Hell yeah.
That if you're like, I'm just going to write a fantasy and I'm going to hit those fantasy points, like I don't even know what that story would be, kind of, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
no, I do know what you mean, because like even if you're going, all right, I'm writing fantasy, but obviously as soon as we get into subgenres, so then we got like high fantasy, medieval sort of English style, and then like if you have magical realism, which can kind of just be anything.
Yeah.
So you're like, wait, do I need knights in my story? I don't know.
When am I setting it? What do I need to stick to and stuff? Yeah. It makes me think of when people talk about their fantasy stories and then they they try and make it as what's the word here? Like as similar to a real life medieval period or whatever as possible. And you're like, why? I mean, you're welcome to do that, but why are you doing that? Why is that necessary for your story? Like you sometimes hear it where people are talking about, and maybe we'll get into this a little bit at some point, like Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah. Because like I've written Dungeons and Dragons campaigns and stuff like that. And you hear people talking about their fantasy world and they're like, well, of course women can't be knights or whatever. And you're like, why? And they're like, well, because they weren't knights in medieval time. And you're like, this isn't the medieval. That's what are you talking about?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Yeah.
And like I think that kind of brings us nicely to something I was hoping to chat about anyway, like is the escapism of genre stories, the genre that we're kind of, the way we're defining it for today.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big draw for me, is like I said, I live the real world shit. Yeah. Give me something heightened and interesting.
Absolutely.
And you're like, you can escape to any world. You can escape to a world where, guess what? Women are still repressed.
Like, why would you do that? You don't have to do that. If you're writing a piece of historical fiction, you could get away with it because you're like, well, I'm trying to make it as true to life as possible. If not, it's your choice. You've decided to make that the case, which is so funny. Yeah, it's funny that like, you can write anything like that. There was a story I was reading. I wish I could remember the name of the author or the story. But it was in the Valancourt collection of World Horror, I think their first volume. And it was just a story about a woman whose parents have passed away and she's cleaning out their house.
Yeah.
And they're hoarders. Right. And so she's cleaning all of this stuff. And then she just discovers in amongst all of the like piles of newspaper and the crap, a tribe of miniature women who have been just living in the house the whole time.
Love it.
And she's like, oh, but it's like, presented very mundanely. She's like, oh, that's like a problem I'm going to have to deal with. Like an infestation. Damn. And then I think she hates her brother and her brother comes home and the women kill him and she's like, oh, whatever, good. But like when I finished reading that, I was like, you can write anything. You can write anything you want. Like there's no rules really.
That's it.
You can sit down and be like, what about if there was a group of tiny women in this person's dead parents' house?
Right, I know.
That's it. That's the story I'm telling. You can just do that.
Yeah.
You can just write that.
And it's it's genuinely very exciting when you have that revelation.
It really is.
You're just like, and then for me, I think it's like you get that nice sort of what if question, and then sometimes it's like the story I find with me, sometimes I can be like, oh, and I can already see what the story is going to be. Other times I'm like, oh, I've got no idea. I've written this as a one sentence thing. Let's see where it goes.
Yeah, for
sure.
And
again, I think both versions are like really exciting for very different reasons. Like the enjoyment comes from slightly different places.
Yeah, big time.
But I think all of it comes from the fact that it's like, I get to explore something I will never explore in real life.
Yeah, for sure.
And like little people, I wish I could come and find a bunch of little people.
Little women just living in a tribe in my parents' house and be like, oh, that's kind of annoying. Damn. Well, get rid of the newspapers, I guess, and hope they don't hassle me too much.
Yeah.
And that's a story you can tell. Yeah, that's for sure.
Like I was reading Neil Gaiman. He's got this book, View from the Cheap Sheets, which is a bunch of his essays, and I think he was talking about a Ray Bradbury story.
Oh yeah,
and through that he was talking about the genre of sci-fi. He gave these three sort of phrases, I guess, that inspire science fiction or speculative fiction or whatever. I actually think it works for all genre personally. But the first one is what if, like what if this existed, which I think is like already that just opens so many doors within my mind. That's of like
incredible. Just like, and it's such a tiny little, like it's two words.
Yeah.
But all of a sudden your mind's going crazy thinking about what if.
Exactly. And then the next one was if only this. So it's like, okay, I think that one's a bit more grounded in like, the world we live on, but if only this other thing happened, then what would that look like?
For sure.
And then the last one is if this goes on, and is more like, if this goes on, things going to get bad.
What's
whatever
the next step?
The thing is. Yeah.
For sure.
And I like all of them. And I like another thing I like about genre is sort of that it gives these beautiful boundaries to you, both as a reader and a writer, that I think is so necessary. Where like sometimes writing is just like, but I could write about anything.
Yeah.
What should I write about today?
That's kind of too broad. That's almost intimidating. Yeah. You're like, I need those parameters, or not even parameters necessarily. I guess just a starting point. Yes. You know what I mean? Like I just need a starting moment to see what happens next, kind of. Yeah,
that's it. And I think, like, obviously for your story, I like that starting point was horror. Then the story got to go wherever it wanted. I think,
for sure.
And this is where you're like, those parameters are great to begin with to get the juices flowing, the train going. But from then on, don't worry about it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You know. It's going to be and it's kind of, I mean, like for me, most of the time, it'll start with that little idea, that little germ of an idea. And then it's like, oh, well, okay, that idea probably falls into horror.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a horror story. What is the story? You write the story. You're like, oh, I guess it wasn't really a horror story. It was like a weird fiction. And then you're like, for me anyway, I'm like, and what was the story about?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like at the end of it, you're like, and what the hell was I saying with all of that?
Exactly, which I think is such a part of writing, especially newbie writers might not realize. You don't have to know what you're doing at all.
Yeah, for sure.
Some of the best stories I think I've written is like, for a long time, for a few years there, because I was sort of working a more 9 to 5, I didn't have as much time during the work week to do writing.
Yeah.
So on the weekends, I'd give myself like an hour or two every day on the week, just on Saturday and Sunday to write.
Yeah.
And I'd often go in with like no plan. This was just free form writing. Let's see what. And same as you, I'd sort of start with this like germ of an idea.
Yeah.
And then I think knowing the genre can help, because even that idea, it can be still too broad.
Yeah, for sure.
For like, okay, somebody, I don't know, grows antlers one morning, what happens next? But you're still like, I don't know what happens next.
Yeah.
Okay, if it's a horror story, okay, things are going to go bad.
Yeah, that's true. But if it's like a magic realism story, things might go regular.
Maybe there's some powers involved. Or if it's a sci-fi story, maybe aliens have come during the night and they're going to come back
for
again.
antlers.
Right, exactly. So like all of it is like, it gives you more of a direction. And then again, from that point, who cares if it goes off brand?
Yeah, 100%.
It's more interesting. So that brings us to another thing I wanted to talk about. You sort of talked about how starting of stories, that first initial birth of an idea. So, like, what has been the process for you with these horror stories you've been writing?
For me, a lot of it, like, sometimes it'll just be, like, 2 words.
Yeah.
So another one of the stories that I've written that, on reflection, I'm like, I don't know if I like this story. But anyway, one of them, I just got in my head, piss ghost. That was it. And I was like, whoa. And it happened so bafflingly. I just finished quite an intense therapy session.
Right.
And I was sitting at my computer after a telehealth, and I was just sitting there, and I was kind of processing everything, and my brain was like, piss ghost. And I was like, okay, all right, let's see where this goes. And so I started just writing the story from that. Like, I'm just like, okay, piss ghost, let's go. And sometimes it can be like that, just 2 words or an image or something like that. But sometimes I think it can also be, like, for me, wanting to capture a specific vibe. And I think horror is quite good for that as well, because you don't, obviously, with horror, you are telling a story. With any writing, you want to be trying to tell some kind of story.
Yes, there needs to be a shake to it.
But horror is nice because sometimes you can be like, well, I'm not really trying. I just want to get across an unsettling vibe. I think some of the best horror stories for me are the ones where you're like, there was no necessarily like a huge monster or a ghoul or a witch or whatever, but the vibes were off. And you're like, if you can manage that, that's great. So sometimes it comes from, I'm just like, well, I want to capture... Like, I was like, I want to capture the feeling of being at a party and the party's starting to wind down and maybe it's like winter and everybody's outside around a fire and somehow just kind of like, you don't even really notice it happening. Everybody's telling their ghost stories. You know, that kind of vibe. And all of a sudden you want to be a little bit closer to the fire and you kind of don't want the ghost stories to end because it's an exciting feeling to hear everybody's ghost stories, but you're looking behind yourself. You're kind of looking up at the house with its bright, you know, like unnatural lights, and you're like, it's safe in there, but it's kind of fun to be unsafe out here. And there's no germ of an idea of that story. There's no like, this is what the narrative will be, but you're just like, how do I get across that? That's what I want to do. I want to put that vibe on paper or whatever.
Yeah. I love that. I think because like for me, I've sort of definitely had some stories where that's been the instigator, where it's like, can I capture that first of all? Like, because again, the challenge of writing is always like, well, it's in my head, and it's beautiful. It's really having a good time up there. How do I get it on the page? And then you're like, so great. That's just a nice, fun challenge to give yourself.
Yeah,
Let's
for
see if I can do it. And then I find inevitably once you start putting words down, like these little details start emerging. And it might just, and this is where I find story really interesting. Where like you can plan all the live long day, but hopefully some real sort of curiosities come through you, like piss ghost. Don't even really know where that came from.
Let's see what happens. And then you don't even know, like with Piss Ghost, I was like, I don't know what this story's going to be about. And I was like, well, the first place I went to is like, you know, like an underpass between 2 parks somewhere in the middle of the suburbs that just smells like piss.
Yes.
I was like, well, that's where I'm thinking. I'm thinking one of them. And I'm like, well, I guess what if that piss isn't piss? It's like a ghost, like a spirit or something. And then I'm like, well, you kind of, and I guess that's kind of how a story happens. You're like, okay, that's down there under the underpass. Who encounters it? And then you're like, well, in my my story, I was like, it's a woman going home from work. And I was like, what does the piss ghost mean? And then, it just kind of like sort of spirals until you end up with a narrative or whatever. And then you do that thing at the end where you're like, what was I saying there? What was I putting into words there?
For sure, and that's it. I think, you don't need to know. Like, then you can always do a second draft and, I think I'm saying this, let's shape it a bit more to fit that.
For sure.
But I think, like having that nice little initial idea, whether it's the vibe or it's the genre or whatever, and then it's just, then it's literally just asking yourself questions and coming up with answers. Like, it's just crazy simple as that. And then hopefully finding, interesting answers.
Yeah, because sometimes you can be like, what about this? And then you write out and you're like, oh, well, okay, that was not worth anything. Never mind.
Oh, the ghost just pisses everywhere. Okay, maybe we'll stand a step back.
There's actually nothing to piss ghost. Okay, well, kese.
But that actually makes me think of something else I really love about genre is where you've kind of got these, again, it's where it's like, it gives you boundaries, but then within those boundaries, you've got so much room to play. It's like the idea of a ghost, for example. Like, what is a ghost? Is it literally a literal spirit who's got unfinished business and hasn't crossed over to any kind of afterlife? Or is it a metaphor for something? Or is it just like a lingering bad smell? Like,
exactly.
Like, this is what I love about genre is that just like it gives you those boundaries, but within those boundaries, there are endless possibilities.
Absolutely. And I think a cool thing you can do with a lot of, because, I mean, like, these, genre is centuries old or whatever.
Sure, yeah.
Is that we have, like, conventions of horror that, like, what am I trying to say here? Like, whereas horror is like, or anything is like, it's the regular world, and then we've put this twist on it, we've put this spice in it. I think because people are so used to the conventions of horror, you can be like, it's a regular horror story, but we've put some spice on that.
Yes,
and that's always nice to be able to do. It's like, it's what has become the new normal in these stories. What's become expected, you can suddenly make unexpected. And you know, I think a ghost is a great example of that. Everybody knows what the shape of a ghost story.
Yes. Yeah.
And so you can be like, well, how's my ghost story shaped different? Like, what about my ghost story is going to throw people off?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that's it. Like, I was even writing, I think this story will have already come out on this podcast. But it's a vampire story. And the first, I wanted to hold off on saying vampire or confirming vampire until the midpoint, basically. Definitely there was more than enough clues for you to go,
yeah, for sure.
I think this girl's a vampire. But yeah, I wanted to hold off just to be, because basically this girl wakes up and finds a dead body next to her bed, and she's just like, oh, shucks, not again.
Gee whiz.
And so the whole story is her just having to get rid of it.
Yeah,
basically.
cool.
But anyway, so the actual like lore of the vampire-ness, I was like, I'll just kind of do standard vampire rules. It's night when she sort of wakes up, because of course it is.
Yeah.
This guy's dead. She's fed on. There's sort of, blood around her mouth, this sort of stuff. And again, I know this has definitely been done by other writers when it comes to vampire, but I'm like, actually, I don't think I want that. I want to like ground it in something. When I was in uni, I studied immunology, and I've always found it so friggin' interesting. Parasites in particular, like so creepy, alien, disgusting, awful. Yeah,
parasites are.
So
nasty.
I'm like, great. This vampirism is a parasite, which I know has definitely been done before.
Yeah, yeah.
But I'm like, okay, but let's dig into what it is, like why, And so straight away, I'm having more fun with it because it's like, okay, regular vampire stuff.
Whatever,
it's been done. How do I put an extra stank on there, that extra spice?
Yeah.
And so then, I'm like, okay, this thing literally replaces her whole circulatory system.
Rules.
Like it is that. So she needs it. That's why it needs blood. It's in her brain a bit, which is sort of, that's why it's so enjoyable for her to drink blood. It also can. Yes, she can bite people, and through that, it might release its own certain kind of neurotoxins. That's the hypnosis sort of coming through, all this sort of stuff. And it was like, as soon as I kind of went on this, it was like all these other blanks started filling in about, okay, what do I like? Yeah, she can eat, because if it's just a parasite, guess what? You still need to eat food. So that's still in there.
And what I really like about that is that all of a sudden, the genre's changed.
Yeah.
Which is really cool.
Yeah, that's true, dude.
It's like, well, you if you're just doing a typical vampire story, it's like it's a vampire story.
Right.
But all of a sudden, maybe there's like a level of body horror to it, or there's a level of, and you kind of, I feel like you like enrich the story a little bit by putting those twists on it. Yeah.
I agree. Like I think when you sort of smash two genres together, it can make for some of the best stuff.
100%.
There's like the genre I find mystery. I'm like, it's like, I don't know, cheese.
Yeah.
You throw it in any meal and somehow you're like, this is great.
Yeah, that's very true. Mystery is one of those ones, it connects to anything. Any genre, you can put mystery on the bottom. That's probably not true. I mean, well, no, it's not true. You can attach any genre to any genre, but some definitely work better than others. And mystery, plug it on anything and it's a good time.
Yeah. Like if you have like horror mystery, it's like, to me, part of it is figuring out how the monster works.
Yeah.
It's that's the mystery element. And I also love, like, for mystery, like, great if you've got a classical detective or Sherlock Holmes or an actual cop or whatever. I love a mystery where the person who has to be the detective has no right to be the detective. They suck. Like, they just happen to be there at that point.
Yeah, for
and
sure.
they've got to solve it for whatever
They're just
reason.
caught up in whatever's going on. 100%. Yeah,
and I think that's great. And, like, same thing for, like, fantasy or magical realism mystery. It's the same thing. It's like figuring out what the hell is going on?
Yeah,
like something is weird. We got to figure it out. That's sort of the mystery. But I think you can throw it on anything. And it's like
you can just tack it on the end and it'll work. Like even those genres we were saying at the beginning, like a Western or a romance.
Yes.
If somebody was like, it's a Western mystery, all of a sudden I'm way more intrigued.
Yeah, dude. Yeah.
Or a romance mystery, which I feel like I'm sure happens, but I've never heard talked about. Already I'm interested, you know what I mean?
And see, again, so this is where genre is so exciting, where it's just like already your brain is percolating with like options, so many ideas, and like, cool, okay, let me write some of these down and get them working. So I think, like knowing genre, especially like we were sort of talking about knowing the start of your story, I think they do kind of work in tandem, because there's so much inspiration that I think that can come from genre. And something we've sort of talked around is like the idea of subverting genre, which is like,
big
talked
time
about so often these days. But I do think that's where like really good stories come from. But I also think it's like trickier than it sounds.
Oh, for sure.
Like, I'll subvert it. So you do like the opposite. And you're like, I think the trick with subverting genre is like you're still fulfilling on the promises, on the tropes of genre, while also giving something completely new and different.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You kind of like subverted horror is still horror.
Yeah,
you know what
right.
I mean? Like
yeah.
you're right. You still need to fulfill the promises. You still need to give that scare or that feeling of unsettling or being unsettled or whatever. But yeah, you're just adding that twist. You're adding that unexpected element to the story.
Yeah, like a horror one. So like there have obviously been a few horrors now like this where it's just like, this is going to be in broad daylight. So like, okay, the usual trope of horror happens at night. We're subverting that.
Yeah.
But all the rest of the tropes, like you said, still being terrified and the
suspense and the tension.
Is all coming across.
You still need to get that there, yeah.
Yeah, if anything, maybe it's like even heightened because, hold on, I thought I was safe in the daytime.
Yeah, exactly. The sun's out. I shouldn't be in danger. One of my favorite horror stories ever is The White People by Arthur Machen. I never know how to say his surname. And he's one of the sort of like early cosmic horror guys. He was a big inspiration for Lovecraft and stuff. The Great God Pan, I think, is his most famous work.
Okay.
It sucks shit. I hate it. Anyway, but I really like The White People. And The White People, it's got this sort of framing device where it's one of those classic like 1800s framing devices where it's three men having an important discussion. I love to do that in old horror books. But anyway, it's like this one guy knows a maniac and is taking his friend to meet the maniac.
Right.
And the maniac's like, sin isn't what you think. You think sin is like a guy stealing your purse or killing a friend. That's not sin. That's bad socially, but that's not like what I'm defining as sin.
Right.
Sin is like if your cat started talking to you. That's sin.
That's cool.
Or a rock grew like a tree. That's sin.
Huh.
And the guy's like, I don't really get what you mean, but that's interesting. And he's like, all right, let me give you this book. Maybe you read this book. This will explain it to you. And what the book is it's a little green diary of like a little girl in the high country of England or whatever, kind of describing in this really sort of stream of consciousness way, like learning these weird rituals and visiting these strange places. But it's kind of great because there's no like value judgments being made by the kid. The kid's just getting it all kind of with no context or no like anything bad is happening. Yeah. So the whole story, it's a horror story, but it's written around the horror story, if you know what I mean.
Cool.
The horror story is like, you just see like glimpses and snippets of it through this kid's very childlike, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and like, and nurse taught me this thing, and I have to say this thing, and I saw this thing, but I'm not going to talk about the thing I saw, and it just does this great job of showing you the shape of the thing without showing you the shape of the thing.
Yeah, that sounds...
And I just love that about it. I love the way the horror is there, but you're not actually looking at it, you know what I mean?
Right, and like even the subversion of obviously usually horror, I think it's usually trying to put you, the audience, as much into the driver's seat as you can, so you are genuinely feeling scared for yourself. Right? Yeah. Where like this one's almost purposely stripping away some of that to go.
Absolutely.
One, it's a little girl whose perspective is so naive, I guess, that she doesn't realize these things are horrible.
Yeah.
And so it should dilute it a bit for you, but if it's still bringing those horror tropes and it's still giving a sense of fear, if anything, like, now you're worried for this girl because she's getting so immersed.
Absolutely what it's like. Yeah, you're like, get out of there. What are you doing?
Yeah.
And like, there's just like these strange moments where like she has this nurse that keeps on telling her these like stories that sound like fairy tales, but you're like, no, I don't know. Like I'm reading into this and I know it's not a fairy tale. Something fucked up has happened here. Sure. And this girl's learning weird little witch secrets, but obviously she doesn't contextualize them as witch secrets. They're just games she's playing with the nurse. And then her nurse just disappears and she's like, oh, my nurse has been gone for 2 years. I don't know where she's gone. And you're like, what happened?
Oh, shit.
What happened? Did her, like, your father find out she was we don't know. And then the sort of story ends and the three guys are like, yeah, that is pretty fucked up.
I guess that's a sin.
Yeah, I guess that is sin. Sin would be if a dog talked to me. But so I love, like, there's so many ways to subvert the genre, other than just doing the opposite or doing even doing the unexpected thing. Like it's you can like, that's the beauty of genre, is knowing those tropes and knowing those conventions and being like, well, let's remove this convention. Let's put this convention. Let's mess it around. Let's let's play with
even just messing with the structure. Like, okay, so we like the idea of not seeing the monster or whatever it is. Okay, so we see the monster in the third act. Yeah, fuck it. Let's see him in the first act. See what that does. You know?
See how that works.
So we're still getting those conventions, but we're playing with different elements of how they play out in the story.
100%. Yeah.
And then another thing I was hoping to talk about was like the idea of when, like, we've talked about sort of merging genres, but like stories where it just like takes a hard left turn from one genre into another.
Big fan. Because that's always interesting. It's so exciting.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden it's like you're starting the story again. You know?
And
All right, here we are. Oh, where's this going to go?
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
One I was thinking about recently is the original Predator.
Oh, yeah.
So I was watching this video essay where they were talking about the guy who made it. So because obviously it was made in the 80s, you've got Beefcake Arnie in there. Yeah. You've got like the first 30 minutes of it is the most extreme machismo American in the 80s action movie you've ever seen. It's like so over the top. And I don't think I really picked up on it because the first time I would have watched it was a while ago, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But it's so like hard on action. It is hitting all the tropes of action. It's doing it to the nth degree. It's really giving you everything you'd want from an action movie. These guys are so like capable. They're killing everyone. Explosions are happening, all the rest of it. And then obviously like at that 30-minute mark when we get into our second act, that's when it changes into horror, arguably slasher.
Yeah, for sure. No, absolutely.
And I really love it because it's like they fulfill on that action. They give you all the action. Like that first 30 minutes, you don't need if it stops being an action movie from here on out.
You've had enough action.
You've actually ticked all the boxes.
Yeah.
Anyone who wanted to get action, you've got it. And then we're like, okay, now we're going to fulfill in the slasher tropes. And again, but we're going to give you a subversion because we've just seen how fucking capable these dudes are.
Yeah, and look at them now. They're struggling. Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely.
And so when normally it's like teenagers who suck, getting killed. Where this is like, no, these guys are ultra capable, but the slasher is also even more capable on top of it.
100%, yeah.
And then we even got like the final girl, like all of it. It sort of blew my mind.
Yeah.
And I love it. And I just think, any movie that can, or any story or book or whatever that does that is always just so satisfying on like literally two levels because you're getting both the genres paid off and the complete shock of it all.
Oh, yeah. That shock, that moment of like where... Like if it's a book or if it's a movie, it's like it's so unexpected. You almost want to pause it and be like, "Whoa, where are we now? What was this? I didn't expect this at all."
Yeah.
I love that. Incredible.
It's where I find myself flipping forward in the book, being like, "Hold on, that person's got to come back, right?"
Yeah, absolutely. But I think sometimes it can not work as well.
Yeah,
I think it's a kind of risky thing to try and pull off.
Great call. Yeah. Yes,
because. Like, and I think as well, it's kind of like mystery. Mystery can tack onto any genre, but then I think there are some genres where if you pull that hard turn and you tack on another genre at the very end, some of them are just not going to be so congruent together.
Yes, that's a good call.
Yeah, and I think some of them as well, like what I keep thinking is fantasy and sci-fi, which are so close to each other, obviously, genres anyway. But I feel like if you pull that hard turn at the end, this fantasy has become sci-fi. I guess what it is, maybe what I'm trying to, like what I'm talking about is you don't want it to feel like a twist.
Yeah.
You don't want it to feel like it was this all along.
Right.
That's just not what you kind of want to be doing.
Yeah.
It's got to be that kind of perfect merging of the two or that, I don't know.
No, I think you're right. And like, I'm trying to think of some bad examples and they probably are, but they're...
The only one I can think of is Cowboys and Aliens.
Right.
I don't know why.
But that's a good example. Whereas great premise. Just and like the fact that they call the movie that because you're like, why the fuck wouldn't you?
Yeah,
Who's
absolutely.
not buying tickets to that?
Yeah.
And then it sucked.
Yeah.
And I'll have to watch it again to think about why it sucks. But I'm going to guess that it probably doesn't actually fulfill on both genre elements.
I don't think it does.
Tropes.
I think, in fact, the whole film kind of just feels like a pretty typical action movie.
Yeah.
Instead of being a Western. Well, you know what a pretty good example is of mixing genres, now that I think about it? Westworld. Did you ever see season 1 of Westworld?
Oh, yeah, I did. Yeah,
so season 1 of Westworld, less so the second two seasons
sure.
or whatever, which got really bad. But anyway, this first season of Westworld does that great job of giving you a Western. It gives you a Western.
100%.
Here's a Western story.
Yeah.
But also there's obviously the sci-fi story underneath, but also there's kind of a horror story happening as well. I think Westworld, the first season at least, does a really good job of mixing those genres together.
Even, and again, mystery. I remember the one thing that caught me was the when they scalped someone, there was like a labyrinth on the back of their scalp.
Yeah, and you're like,
and I was like, I need to know everything about
this. What is going on
there?
Yeah.
That is a great example. And I think, because it's fulfilling on those tropes all the way through, like, especially the Western element. Like, and again, like I said, I'm not as big on Westerns, but that's one where I'm like, I was loving the Western elements.
And I think you really noticed the absence of it when the second season didn't have it as much. And then when the third season was just like this full sci-fi.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, I'm realizing now that actually what I was enjoying about it was these Western elements.
Yeah.
Without it, it's not the same show.
For sure. Like, I really, because I think in the end of the first season, they talk about like it's a bit of, because the other theme parks, I guess, that they have. And I think there was one that was like a bit of an Asian bent one. I'm like, samurais, everything. Like, great, that should be season 2. Like, I kind of wanted to stay within these worlds of the theme park so we could keep getting it's such a nice way to keep throwing genres together.
Absolutely.
But then obviously full sci-fi.
Yeah, they threw it away. I know, I think season 2 introduced Raj World.
Yeah.
There's a World War II world, and you're you have so many genres here you could be playing with.
Right. Again, I don't care about the real world. No, throw me into there.
The least interesting part of Westworld is the real world, but for some reason that was the place in the entirety of season 3 took. So but I think Westworld does a good job of mixing quite a few genres together, certainly the first season. Into something entertaining.
But there are definitely, I think the bad examples are more you forget them because they suck a bit or whatever. But I think you're right. Like we were sort of even just saying, for a single genre, if you don't fulfill on the promise, the genre fans aren't gonna like it, basically, and understandably, because I think you're making a promise by saying, and again, we're talking about not from the writing, the start point, but from further down the process.
Yes, absolutely.
This is a whatever story, great. Where if you start a story and it turns out, it is just weird.
Yeah, then whatever. That's how you're,
Great. Now you've got that genre to play in, which might even be more fluid. Obviously, there are different genres have different levels of sort of tropes and rules and all the rest. But the ones, especially the ones where they merge them, I think, you've just sort of exponentially increased the amount of fucking up you might do in this story.
That's true.
Yeah.
You've started to promise twice as many things to us, the reader, that you might not fulfill.
That's it.
Yeah, for sure.
Another one I was just thinking of is Psycho, where I'd even say the first half of it is arguably romance. Where our protagonist, I can't remember her name now, but she's obviously going to the hotel. She's excited to see her dude and all the rest of it, and then takes that hard left turn into, oh no, this is a horror slasher, but even from the point of view of the murderer. Ballsy.
Absolutely. So ballsy. And, it worked.
Obviously, one that's sort of lasted the test of time. That's clearly one that worked for people. And I think even audience, I know the first time I watched it, which was only when I was at uni, doing my master's, because I was black and white old movie, no thank you. And then, we had to watch it. I was like, that was awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, I remember watching it in high school when I was even less interested.
Right, yeah.
I was like, oh my God. But it's enthralling. You're like, I'm hooked. I'm there the whole time.
Yeah. So other than horror, what other genres do you find yourself drawn to?
For writing, it's just been horror so far. But I also do, for Sans Pants and for my personal life, a lot of role-playing.
Yeah.
Which is a kind of different beast entirely, because role-playing is, you're still writing a story, but the characters in your story, some of them aren't controlled by you. So you kind of got to preempt what those characters might do to try and tell a story. And I know something I'm really guilty of in those kind of role-playing scenarios is that I just clearly have a story I want to tell and everybody's all over the road. Which is a big faux pas, and it's not how you're meant to do it. But so often I'm like, no. You're just along for the ride. You enjoy it. And so that will be fantasy, that can be mystery, that can be sci-fi occasionally even. Fantasy as a genre is something that I always kind of struggle with. I don't think it interests me terribly much.
Right.
And I think that can sometimes, so I have a D&D campaign. It's a very long story I've been telling with a bunch of friends for about 2 years now. I think we started at the beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And even the characters that I play in the Sans Pants podcast, D&D is for Nerds, something Adam, the DM of that, always says is that every character I make is fighting the genre. Every character I make is there to be like, I'm not a fantasy guy. I don't hate fantasy. I quite like fantasy.
Yeah.
But it's really not my genre. And so every character, I guess, is this weird attempt at subversion or this weird fighting the system kind of thing. And often I'm not doing it on purpose. It's just, and then this fantasy campaign, this D&D campaign, the whole thing is fighting the tropes of Dungeons and Dragons and the tropes of fantasy or whatever. It's kind of set in this very my kind of idea was it's like a very typical fantasy world, your basic fantasy story, but this all happened before the pandemic as well, which is so funny. One of the places in the world is called Old Corona. Absolutely coincidental.
Oh no.
And a big plague has kind of like swept the world. And the basic kind of beginning thought for it was, what if it was like the Black Death?
Yeah.
But it was werewolfism.
So
this werewolf plague has swept the world. And it's a very typical Dungeons and Dragons world. So there was like an adventurers league and a bunch of, plucky adventurers who would come and save the day. But then it turned out these werewolves or whatever were just too dangerous, too powerful.
Right.
None of the adventurers could do it. And so the world was like, well, fuck you guys. You meant to help us in this situation. So you didn't. So it's kind of a fantasy setting.
Yeah.
Like a D&D setting where the good guys didn't failed. The conventions of the world that everybody expects to work have stopped working. The things that were once important are no longer important. What does that look like or whatever? So it's just kind of the same thing. It's kind of, again, fighting fantasy, fighting those stories. And it's the same thing with all of my characters.
Right. But I think that's so interesting. I think for the role-playing stuff, just some of the stuff that I've other podcasts I've listened to, or now there's even a few TV shows and that sort of thing. I do find that because they're so grounded in genre, but because you've got so many brains playing away at it, they really do end up subverting it quite a bit, or not even necessarily subverting it. I think pushing the boundaries of what is fantasy. I think someone who's fantasy, especially high fantasy in particular, which I kind of get. So my journey with genre started with high fantasy. I was definitely a little fantasy nerd all through high school. Read them all. That was the only sort of genre I was interested in. I think I started with Raymond E. Feast was my guy, and then both my brothers big old fantasy nerds as well. But we all sort of had our authors that we chose. So, Matt was David Gemmell, and then Jono was David Eddings was one of his main dudes, and eventually I got into Robert Jordan, so Wheel of Time. But either way, there's obviously so much of that. It can keep you entertained for a good long time. And then it was I think that pretty much got me through almost till after high school, uni. And then finally I started to go, I feel like I've read all these stories. You get to the next assassin book and you're I've definitely read this story before. And then I sort of jumped from there to probably more magical realism.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
And then I think that led me from there to sci-fi. I would say I've only really gotten into horror, definitely for film only the last few years because of Scaredy Boys, but books a little bit maybe before that.
Oh, yeah.
And now I really love it. And then mystery, same sort of thing. But I'm 30. It's taken me all years to just find the next genre. I think they're all sort of this. They all give you different things, but I think the things they give, for me with horror, is it's still a thing of our world, but something interesting and unique, and I never realized that was the element to it, and then of course I can enjoy that. And
for sure. And I think that's what I kind of like about horror as a genre, because I think I was a big fantasy kid as well. Yeah, even though I don't love it so much now.
But I wonder if that's because for me I found myself burnt out on.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think I was kind of the same, and I randomly started reading this trilogy of books that I never hear anybody talk about by an Australian author named Glenda C. Clark, I think her name is. And it was one of the first fantasy stories that I kind of read as a teenager, after kind of reading some of those kind of more young kid oriented fantasy stories or whatever. And it's super low fantasy, super weird, super full of subverting.
Yeah, great.
It's there are two kinds of magic users on these island chains, and there's this framing device that's basically a proxy of colonial England coming to colonize the islands that don't have any magic, and they've arrived on these islands, and there's Sylv magic users who can heal people and their magic is blue. Right. Then there's Dun magic users who can hurt people and their magic is red, and then there's people called the Aware who are immune to all magic and they can visually see it.
Right.
But then in the second book, they meet a doctor who lives in these highland plains where they barely ever see magic users, and the doctor's I reckon it's a disease.
Ooh.
And they're well, how do we defeat the big bad? And he's I reckon we could cure magic. And you're
that's awesome.
That kicks ass. And I think that really influenced what I wanted out of a fan. Because if I read, because I think, those early stories, the tropes were subverted, the genre was subverted. Going back to the unsubverted form, I was a bit well, yeah, but you're not doing anything. You're just showing me a dwarf. You know what I mean? And that's all fine and dandy, but do something with that dwarf. Yeah. Tell me about that dwarf. So, but then it's funny with me with horror, which is my favorite genre. I was such a cowardly kid.
Right.
I had to get the librarian to turn around the Goosebumps books because I just didn't like looking at them.
Right.
I remember getting a Goosebumps Tarzo in a thing of Doritos when I was 7, crying, getting my mom to pull the car over so we could throw the Tarzo in the bin because I was so scared of it. And it was I think the book's called I forget what the book's called, but the cover and what was on the Tarzo is a guy in a big sandwich, a giant sandwich, and he's in it about to be eaten. I couldn't handle it.
Weirdly sounds like the kind of story you would now write.
Yeah, exactly. Just have a therapy session and get big sandwich in my head and write it down. But and then I had when I was a teenager, I started reading horror again. But for some reason, the horror books I read were there's pulpy, tawdry, like 1970s glossy covered horror books. They were all full of sex scenes and weird I don't know. I read so many of them. Just these, and then I started to move on to like, well, let's read some of the classics. And that's kind of where I'm at the moment. But it's funny those genre journeys that you go through.
Yeah, another one I think is about more, I guess, more back with fantasy is every once in a while I'll jump back into a high fantasy book and be like, let's see if someone's got something new. And sometimes, oh, okay, that's a different take. And then other times you're like, oh, no.
Damn.
But the ones that I found myself like the fantasy where I'm like, oh, this is giving me what I used to get from high fantasy when I was a kid.
Yeah.
It's just like Ghibli movies.
Oh, yes,
where it's
big
like,
time, true.
This is fantasy, but it's like, I don't know what's coming next.
Yeah.
Where obviously with more traditional high fantasy, I'm like, I know to the T what's going to happen next. Yeah.
And I guess that's kind of one of the, like, the problem. Well, not the problems of genre, but that's it's a risk.
Yes. No, I agree. Yeah. I agree. And one thing I wanted to ask you about was like, so off mic, you were talking about how you've been reading these really great horror anthologies, often ones from like stories from all around the world.
Yeah.
And so I think for Ghibli, it's like, even though some of the stories they take are Western stories originally in the book form, but I think because they've just got, I mean, definitely Miyazaki is just like, he's a unique individual brain, so I don't want to paint their whole continent with that brush. But like, I do think there is something with different cultures coming at the same genres. You're going to get something different. So yeah, I was just hoping you could tell us a bit more about those world horror stories.
Well, yeah, I really recommend them just because it's a kind of fascinating journey. The Valencourt Publishing do a bunch of great anthologies and they do a lot of really good reprints as well of books that have been out of print for ages. A lot of horror, I think mostly horror, a lot of queer fiction as well, and maybe some fantasy, but I can't remember. But yeah, I saw it just on Amazon, the Valencourt Book of World Horror. I was like, that's a really interesting idea. And yeah, it's really fascinating because I think it's the same with Ghibli. Yeah. You know, Ghibli... you're right. Even if it's a Western story, you can tell that there is probably a drawing on like Japanese folklore and stuff. Certainly with like the sort of straight Ghibli narratives where they're not adapting anything. You're
like Spirited Away.
And Totoro and stuff. You're like, these are, you can see the Japanese and even Princess Mononoke, I think maybe. Yeah. And you can, and it's the same thing with the Valencourt Book of World Horror. You'll read a story from Trinidad and you'll be like, well, this is absolutely a creature or a kind of conventions that I've just never encountered in fiction before. Like there's a really good one. I think it's Trinidadian. I might be wrong.
Right.
About a specific kind of zombie they have over there called a screamer, and it's about this guy. He's like arriving in town for business. Hears a screaming. He's like, oh, why is everybody? What's that screaming? Can't handle it. Yeah. And it goes in a bunch of directions you don't expect because you just have no. It's like the opposite of that high fantasy thing. You don't know what's coming next. You've got no frame of reference for what's going to happen. Next in the story. I think Valencourt. What's really good as well is that. The popular authors from those world horror books, they've translated a bunch of their stories into English really recently. Right. And they're I know there's one by a guy named Chris Akers, I think, or Chris Angers, which was the only book in the anthology where I was like, I am legitimately disturbed. Like, I have become unhappy having read that. That was a bad time. I've ordered his book because I'm like, I need it. I need to be properly fucked up by everything he's written.
Right.
But yeah, so it is really cool. It's really worthwhile, I think, especially if you like horror, to be like, well, what scares other cultures? You know what I mean? What are the things that frighten those other cultures that I've maybe never encountered before?
Yeah. And I think it comes again back to that point of genre where there is like that danger you mentioned of familiarity of like, okay, I see what you're doing. And that's obviously less satisfying. But I think like the thing I think about, especially fantasy stories from different cultures or horror, actually know any of them really, is because their you don't realize how much our mythologies bleed into our little brains. Like we're just so familiar with Western mythologies in terms of like some folk stuff, but definitely I'd say even like high fantasy arguably is kind of
for
Western mythology. Where like I've read some sort of world mythology books, or like I've had some just from Japan because I do think like their mythology
it's very cool, rocks.
But like even like Russian mythology, there's some super interesting stuff, and there's so much in there, like just their old fairy tales and mythologies or myths or whatever, and they're so diverse and interesting, and you realize, I've only had like a tiny slice of the pie.
100%.
And immediately, like there is so much more out there that's so interesting, and I wonder for the audiences from their cultures, if they're like, of course that's that thing, it's the screamer zombie. You know?
Like I know what it is the moment I start reading it. Yeah,
and so for them, maybe it's not as like engrossing because it's not as new.
Yeah.
But again, I guess it makes me excited for genre where you're like, oh, there's so much more out there.
So much more than you would at first imagine. You just got to kind of find it. Yeah. It's funny that like, taking from folklore and how much like it makes me think of like a vampire or a werewolf. Like these are fairly. Not in terms of the base concept, because a lot of other cultures have their vampires and their like the same kind of conventions, I guess. But like what we imagine of as a vampire or werewolf, it's kind of you're always coming back to that same basic idea. And what I think about is it would be so interesting to try and write a new one. And I don't mean like a new vampire or a new werewolf, but to be like, I'm making a creature.
Yes.
With conventions, with rules, the same way a vampires, the same way a werewolf, the same way a zombie. Like to try and, it's in many ways, it feels almost like trying to think of a new color. You know what I mean?
I agree. Yeah.
You're like, how could I take that next step? How could I make some kind of being that doesn't feel like any of the other beings? How can I do that without it kind of being too ridiculous? So I don't know.
For sure.
And then I think, reading those kind of other cultures' mythologies and stuff, it's kind of like that's kind of like seeing those new creatures. Yeah.
Like, and I've had ones where I've tried to do the same thing. I'm like, okay, I think I've got to like, all right, they're humanoid, but they like suck the soul. So you're like, oh, that's a vampire.
Yeah, damn it,
I've just swapped blood with like soul or whatever.
They're a human, but they become a I made a werewolf.
It's just a different life of a werewolf. Yeah. But then, like, there are, like, again, to go to the Japanese, so, like, I think if we think of ghost, generally you're like, oh, Victorian England person in it, like that. I'm like, that's so boring as a ghost type.
Yeah.
Where, like, for Japan, they've literally got, like, the yokai. So they've literally got so many different definitions of what different types of ghosts.
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
One size does not fit all. You can have like the toilet ghost who just lives in the toilet. That's
They've got that one that just looks like an umbrella with like an eye on the handle. That rolls. That's so good.
Their ghosts are like Pokemon. There's just so many variations. And like for me, I think again, that's like really exciting. You're like, oh, okay, I need to push my brain to push the genre, push those single elements of genre and find the same thing but completely different.
Yeah, absolutely. Try and kind of like expand what and I think in many ways it kind of comes back to that, like you can write whatever you want. Yeah. It's like you gotta expand your mind to be like, and that's the beauty of genre, I guess, is it's here if you need it. Yeah. But if you don't want to, you don't have to engage with all elements of it. Yeah. You can write whatever you like. Yeah.
That's it. I think that's a beautiful takeaway. Just write whatever you want. It's gorgeous. Yeah. All right. Well, look, thanks so much, dude. This has been an absolute
thanks for having me on.
Blast. I've been
this was great.
So looking forward to it. It's been everything I wanted. All right. Well, if you'd like to hear more from Jackson, you can check out his always enjoyable podcast, Plumbing the Death Star, Thumb Cramps, Baseless Speculation, and so many others. I was like, do I write them all down? No, there's too many. Yeah. Just head over to Sans Pants Radio. There's so much stuff there. Like Jack said, there's so much D&D and role-playing stuff for you story nerds that are they absolutely rule. Or you can find Jackson on Twitter at AllDogsAreDead. And as for me, you can find me on Twitter at MiddayPajamas. Or feel free to send me an email at shorttales.podcast@gmail.com. Until next time, this has been Short Tales, and I've been Damian Robb.